Hola, bona tarda a tothom. Gràcies per venir en aquest moment que tothom està ple de tot, final de curs, però jo penso que l'ocasió valia la pena. Nosaltres també estem absolutament sobrepassats de tot, de feina, de finals, de tot, però tenir a David Berliner i a Úrsula Casanova a Barcelona i no compartir-lo amb la comunitat educativa em semblava que no era possible. Alguns de vosaltres coneixeu a David Berliner i avui el coneixereu una mica més. Per nosaltres, per el grup Esbrina, l'educació és quelcom fonamental, és un dret fonamental de tot individu, el que millor li pot passar a un individu és poder tenir accés a l'educació, i nosaltres pensem que els països que tenen una educació pública, àmplia, plural, que pensa en els éssers humans com a persones que poden devenir. Per nosaltres els països amb els que ens mirem són països com Finlàndia, com Noruega, com Dinamarca, que tenen molt clar que l'educació ha de ser per tothom, inclusiva, àmplia, etc. Bé, presentaré a David, pels que no el coneixeu. David Berliner és catedràtic regent emèrito de la Universitat d'Arizona. Després, és molt important, ell va ser, no sé si coneixeu l'Associació Americana de Recerca Educativa, és una associació que cada any organitza una trobada, i aquest any nosaltres vam anar, hi havia 14.000 persones de tot el món, la majoria dels investigadors en educació estaven allí. Ell va ser president, ara és expresident, i també va ser president de la divisió d'educació de l'APA, de l'American Sociological Association. Són llocs que, sabeu que tenen molta responsabilitat i molt ressò. Ha tingut diversos premis, però sobretot els premis per mi són importants perquè són sempre premis de reconeixement a una tasca de defensa de l'educació, de la qualitat i de l'equitat. També en els últims anys ens ha interessat d'una manera especial, perquè l'hem seguit molt de prop, dos llibres que jo penso que s'han de llegir. Jo els vaig demanar a Mundet estan. Un es diuen Collateral Damage, no sé si sabeu que als Estats Units hi ha una falera de testing, de passar proves als nanos en un moment donat, i aquestes proves tenen unes repercussions brutals. Inclús hi ha escoles que les tanquen si els nanos no passen les proves al nivell que sigui. I això genera moltes coses que ell ho l'explicarà millor que jo. I això és important perquè a Anglaterra ho estan seguint, i aquí, con el senyor Wert, també. I cuidado que no prenguem mal. Llavors això és molt important. Fixeu-vos que es diu Collateral Damage, danys col·laterals, com a les guerres. I l'altre que va ser publicat aquest any, l'any passat, el 2014, que es diu Mites i mentides que estan amenaçant a l'escola pública. Volia parlar també una mica de la Úrsula, perquè ha escrit un llibre que jo us ho recomano. Ella també està en l'època del júbilo, està jubilada també, i va escriure, ja jubilada, va fer una etnografia preciosa en una escola que fa bastants anys es va proposar que els nens mexicans que sistemàticament fracassaven a l'escola secundària tinguessin un lloc per aprendre, tinguessin un lloc on poguessin desenvolupar tot el seu potencial. I van crear una escola que es diu Cipolla, i ella va fer una etnografia, i el títol és Sí se puede, en castellano, i després les escoles públiques que rebateixen les estadístiques. Jo vull fer també aquest reconeixement a la Úrsula, perquè nosaltres hem après molt de tots dos. I finalment us deixo amb la conferència del David, que ja ha canviat una mica el títol, però a mi ja em sembla bé. I també dir-vos que si voleu podeu tutejar, ja sé que és molt llarg, que el hashtag és molt llarg, però si voleu tutejar, Esbrina Educació Pública, i aquest és el nostre Twitter. Moltíssimes gràcies per venir a tots, i ara us deixo amb el David, que és l'important.
Today I want to share with you some aspects of the book I wrote with my colleague, Gene Glass, very famous statistician, and we wrote it with 19 of our students. So you students, get ready to start writing books. You can do it. 19 of our students worked with us on this. Our goal was to begin conversations about things we thought were really stupid that were going on in the United States. For many years, we had just complained about things, and then we realized that we had to do something. We started our complaining about stupid laws when the Bush administration and hundreds of our Congress people signed a bill called the No Child Left Behind Bill, 2002, under President Bush, and it required every child in the USA to be proficient in academic work. Now, in the English language, proficient is a level above average. So you should be very frightened because the Congress of the United States, the most powerful country in the world, is filled with people who think 100% of the students can be above average. You can. Average is defined very clear, okay? 50%, okay? They want 100% above average. That takes a miracle, and we're out of those usually. It's very frightening that our Congress believes that. Our legislators did it again under President Obama by supporting something called value-added assessments, or VAMs, value-added models. A value-added model to evaluate teachers means take the student's test score from, let's say, 3rd grade, and their student's test score at the end of 4th grade, and look how much value added was provided by the teacher. The only problem is teachers don't affect test scores very much, the test scores, the standardized test scores. They affect what happens in classrooms, but not the standardized test scores. If a teacher gets an extra few language learners, a teacher gets an extra few special ed students, scores will go down the 2nd year. If a teacher gets an extra few children who are the sons or daughters of college-educated parents, the scores will go up that year. This is well known to every teacher, but it's not part of the evaluation system. We're just going to take the 2 tests, evaluate the value added by teachers, and then fire them if they don't provide value, give them $5,000 if they do well, really well. It's the market economy brought into teaching, and it's dangerous, stupid, doesn't work, invalid. All of those words hold, but our president does it, wants it, our Secretary of Education wants it, people all over the country are looking at it as a way to evaluate teachers. So that was the one that we really got fed up with and decided it's time to put our views out in front of people. We took as our guide for writing our book certain people and certain aphorisms that exist. So we took Thomas Jefferson, one of our founding fathers, at his word. He said, "Ridicule is the only weapon which can be used against unintelligible propositions." So what he was saying was, you know, make fun of people who say stupid things. Patrick Moynihan, one of our senators, at a hearing in the Senate, said to a person that was a witness, he said, "You are entitled, sir, to your own opinions, but not your own facts." A Latin phrase, quod gratis assuratur, gratis negatur, that which is alleged without proof may be dismissed without explanation. Just dump it. Noam Chomsky, one of our great intellects, says educational reform, which is the word used in the United States a lot, educational reform is a euphemism for the destruction of public education. There are a lot of people saying they're reformers, and what they want are private schools and charter schools and other ways of getting rid of public education. That's happening in Europe as well as in the United States. And finally, Aldous Huxley, facts do not cease to exist because they are ignored. So those were the kind of things we had in mind when we were writing our book. We wanted to use research and logic to point out myths, lies, stupid things that people said. Originally, we only said we were going to confront myths. But then we discovered some people lied. They just simply lied about schools. So we added lies to our title. For example, I'm sure you all know Bill Gates. Everybody knows Bill Gates, one of the richest men in the world. And he said not long ago that our public schools are clearly not doing well since the USA has increased its funding dramatically and the scores on the tests go down or stay the same. Well, that's what he said. And when you're the richest man in the world, or one of them, people take you very seriously, and the newspapers write up what you say. The only problem is, Bill Gates was wrong. For example, funding is up in the United States, but that's because of rising enrollments in special education, particularly in the categories of ADHD, deficit disorder, and autism. We thus had rising costs because of those special education kids. Here's some recent data Bill Gates didn't know about. In 1976-77, we had 3 million kids in special ed, but in 2011, we had 6 million kids in special ed. As the percentage of the enrollment in the United States, we had 8.3%, then we had 12.9%. So of course the costs went up. That's what you do when you are a generous nation with a lot of money. You try to build special education programs for the children who need it and for the families who need that help. So instead of being embarrassed by it or upset by it, we should be proud of it. And Bill Gates is saying we're spending too much money. Well, that's a mistake. And by the way, while we had the numbers went up 58%, teachers' salaries went down during that same time period in real dollars, $180. So more special ed kids, less salaries for teachers in real dollars, inflation-adjusted dollars. So Bill Gates was wrong about the costs, but he was also wrong about the scores on tests. Very easy to get the scores. We have something called the NAEP test, National Assessment of Educational Progress, given every year or every couple of years to students throughout the United States. And here's the scores that Bill Gates said were flat. In every category, mathematics age 9, mathematics age 13, reading age 9, reading age 13, white students, black students, Hispanic students, you can read, every one of those scores is up, every one of them. But Bill Gates said to the newspapers, and it was quoted all over, that the scores are flat. Well, I have a suggestion for somebody with $50 billion. Get a fact checker. That's what newspapers do. That's what magazines do. They check their facts. If you're the richest person in the world, for 50,000 American dollars, you could hire a fact checker and not even notice it. That's just change to Bill Gates. So we got mad and we put things about lies in our title of our book. People are saying things that aren't true. There are others who lie, or maybe if we're charitable, they just can't get their facts straight. But among them are our Secretary of Education and our President. They talk about STEM education. I don't know if you use the words here. We talk about STEM education: science, technology, engineering, and math. STEM, STEM education. And everybody's running around the United States saying, we don't have enough STEM workers. The United States is going to disappear if we don't have more scientists and engineers. We need to have our schools doing better in STEM work. The president said we need 100,000 more STEM teachers by the year 2020. So we have everybody pushing for STEM in the United States. They always have been. In 1934, there's a quote. In 1945, there's a quote. In 1954, there's a quote. In 1970, 1983, 1993, Bill Gates said it in 2008. The head of Texas Instrument, a big tech company, said it in 2013. And in the State of the Union, the president said it. We have a shortage in STEM. All the schools should be teaching STEM. Well, there's a little problem. If you ask how many vacancies there are in the United States for STEM workers, the answer is 277,000 a year. That's from the Bureau of Labor Statistics and from the International Electronics and Engineering Journal, two very reputable places. The Bureau of Labor Statistics is actually headed by Obama, but he doesn't seem to read their reports. So here's what we need every year to meet the requirements of our industry. Here's what we produce every year. 252,000 bachelor's degrees, 80,000 master's degrees, 20,000 PhDs, 40,000 STEM associate degrees, the two-year college degrees, and 50,000 special visas given often to Asians and Indians and others who have STEM training. So we bring them in because we have a shortage. The only problem is if you add that up, you learn that we have 442,000 new STEM graduates a year for 277,000 jobs. We have a surplus every year of 165,000 STEM workers. Why would you say things like that? Maybe to drop the cost of labor. If you overproduce STEM workers, an engineer can't start out at 80,000. They have to start out at 60,000 US. So these are lies. These are simply lies being told by our president and others. Besides that, turns out we have 11.4 million people with STEM degrees not working in STEM fields. They work in other fields, sometimes related, but we have no shortage of talented citizens in science, technology, engineering, and math. So when you hear about all these needs, be careful about it. Try to get the statistics. We did, and we discovered a lot of people are lying. There are lots of other things wrong with the American beliefs about the schools. We were told that the Chinese and Korean kids are outperforming us and they're much smarter than our kids. They don't tell you that the Korean kids in particular, but Chinese and Japanese kids in general, spend a lot of their day after school in school. So they get like double the schooling. Because their schools are not particularly good, the parents pay for juku schools or after-school schools. Korea had to pass a law to stop children from studying after 10 o'clock at night, okay, so that they have some life. This is not the kind of childhood that Spanish people have for their children or US people have for their children. We don't want our children studying that hard. Maybe individual families do, but the culture doesn't. Children should play, there should be sports. And we'll talk a little more about that. Anyway, the US newspapers are so worried about our test performance, and particularly against Asian countries, that we need a more rigorous curriculum now, including testing kindergartners. Now, kindergartners in my country are 5 years old. There was a child that was put on a computer screen to take a test recently, and the newspaper reporter was in the room, and the kid raised his hand and said to the teacher, "Excuse me, I can't take this test because I can't read yet." I mean, the world has gotten a little crazy when we're trying to test very young kids that way. Last week or 2 weeks ago, it was reported in the newspapers that a child came home with a report card from kindergarten that evaluated 40 different aspects of the child's behavior. Whether they sit still or not, whether they play well with others, whether they know their numbers up to 10 or up to 100. But it went on and on and on. 40 things were evaluated. Well, I can remember my mother going into my kindergarten teacher and saying, "How's David doing?" The teacher said, "Fine." My mother went home. That's all. I mean, you can't break it down into little tiny pieces and evaluate children on that. That's not the way children learn. It's not the way the world works. And we're so frightened that children will not get good scores. We're doing crazy things. We are a country, and increasingly a world, so you have to face it too, that is pathologically obsessed by metrics of one sort or another. PISA, TIMSS, PEARLS are all symptoms of the global metrification of people and organizations. I mean, I'm a numbers man. I come out of research. There are a whole bunch of educational psychologists here. They know how to read reports. They know how to look at data. But you don't get obsessed with it. You have to understand what numbers mean. And politicians and newspaper people don't usually do that. So to score kindergarten kids, we now have new standards. And the new standards are very explicit about what every child needs to know at age 6 and 8 and 10. And that's going all over the world. It's a little crazy when it's too molecular. This is from Lockport, Illinois. They're very proud. They're pleased to announce that their district will implement a new standards-based report card for kindergarten students. Here's what the kindergarten kids need to know. For English language arts, we expect the kids to follow words left to right, top to bottom, page by page, recognize how spoken words are represented, understand that words are separated by spaces, blah, 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 blah. Then for reading informational texts, in their wisdom, the people who wrote the new standards said, children are reading too many novels, too many things for enjoyment. They need to read for information. I mean, whoever did that has never had a child, never seen a child, never touched a child, never smelled a child. You can't ask children to read informational texts only. They need to develop loves of literature. And we have breaking this up. Informational texts determine the meaning of words, determine the meaning of multiple meanings, use sight words. These are 5-and-a-half-year-olds. This is bizarre. It goes on. Reading literature, thinking beyond the text, thinking about the text, and they have these set of things for writing and mathematics as well. Currently, kindergarten kids are tested 11.3 3 hours on average, and grade 1 students are tested 11.6 hours on average. Total test preparation time is 26 hours for these exams, and this is more testing than used to be allotted for all of elementary school visual arts. This is a perversion of schooling. We want to compete with Korea, I guess, but the Korean culture is different. And they're entitled to raise their children the way they want, but we should be entitled to raise our children the way we want. We forget that we only invented childhood about 150 years ago. If you know your history, childhood didn't exist. Children were in the stables cleaning out the horse muck and stuff. Children were in their mother's kitchen helping at 3 years of age. They're in their father's shoemaker shop cleaning up and doing things. Childhood wasn't invented until the 1800s or so, when we became rich comparatively to previous generations and could afford a childhood for our children. But now we want them to be, and here's the words of our Secretary of Education, career and college ready at age 5 or 7. Sometimes you have to say to people that they're really stupid. I think our Secretary of Education is really stupid. This is what he said recently. I'm quoting him. We should be able to look every second grader in the eye, that's a 7-year-old, every second grader in the eye and say, you're on track. You're going to be able to go to a good college or you're not. I think that's evil. To stamp a kid's head and say you're unable to go to college, you're not smart enough, and you are. That's bizarre. That's evil. Somebody has to stop these people, and I'm trying my best. Here's something I picked up the other day. The psychiatrist talking to the child. Where do you see yourself 5 years from now? That's really funny and sad and part of the culture I now live in. I find a lot wrong with all of this concern for our youth in my country and in Western Europe in general, because PISA has made a lot of countries nervous about their youth. My generation was told we could not compete in the world. I went to high school a long time ago, ancient history to you people here, 1950s in high school. We were told we could not compete with the Russians. We were lazy. We can't. Ivan was going to beat David. My generation was told we couldn't compete. We were lazy. We can't read. A big hit book that year was Why Johnny Can't Read. We liked rock and roll. We were impolite. We smoked too much marijuana. And those high-achieving Russians were going to beat the United States. Remember, Sputnik went up 1957, so we were doomed in the United States. Except something interesting happened. In the last part of the 20th century, it's often called the American century, and the United States reached eminence as a nation with my generation of illiterate, impolite, marijuana-smoking youth. Okay? We didn't do so bad for the United States. We created Apple, we created Google, we created Microsoft. We didn't do so bad. But in 1950, as we were in high school, we were told how stupid we were. So you learn not to take this very seriously eventually. After the Russians, you may remember the Japanese were going to beat everybody. They were going to beat the United States because they studied so much more. They didn't beat us either. Not long ago, two famous people in the United States said that our military can't compete because we haven't got smart enough soldiers. And I responded to this in a newspaper article. I said, I have a little different take on this. If we can't compete as a military, it must be because we have the stupidest generals and admirals in the world. Because, now listen, the United States spends more on our armed forces, we spend more than Turkey, China, Britain, France, Russia, Japan, Saudi Arabia, Germany, India, Italy, Brazil, South Korea, Australia, and Canada combined. That's how much we spend on our military. If we can't win a war, we must have the stupidest people running the army the world has ever seen. But they're blaming the schools. Okay? We don't get enough bright people into the military. Well, if you're very bright, you don't want to go to Iraq or Iran or Afghanistan. Maybe that's why they're not getting bright people in the military. Anyway, these particular two people who are bad-mouthing the schools are paid by Pearson Education to say bad things about the public schools. One of them works for Pearson. Anyway, you can see that I'm not real happy about all the people who make fun of our schools. I've heard it all before. I read about it once. Socrates was the first person who started this trend. He went around the streets of Athens, if you remember, saying the youth of Athens was failing Athens. They didn't know history. They were impolite to their elders. They weren't treating them nicely. And Athens would perish. And Athens perished 500 years later. So Athens managed to hold on too. The childhoods in other countries that get very high scores are nightmares by US standards and I think Spanish standards. Anyone who wants to raise a Korean-style or Chinese-style student in the United States is free to do so, and it is true that in the United States, children raised by Korean and Chinese and Japanese parents do very, very well in our schools, even if they're poor. The culture is one of scholarship, and it matters, it pays off. But we have a different view of childhood. We go crazy over the Super Bowl and other sports. I've been here when the World Cup was on. Your kids are not studying. Your kids are all watching the World Cup. Americans want our kids to swim, to play tennis, to do field hockey, to play football. On weekends, we don't mind if our kids watch TV or play with friends or hang out. The majority of Americans don't expect our kids to rush into their homework after school. And we actually have teenage dances and teenage dating. Nothing will lower your score more than teenage dances and teenage dating. In fact, many Americans even think it might be harmful if we had a child who studied all the time. I used to worry about my son. He paid too much attention to studying. So we have a different view of childhood. With our widespread beliefs about how childhood and youth should be spent, we in the USA, and you in Barcelona, because I've been with people seeing how you raise your kids, you will never, 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 never compete well with the students of a few Asian nations. Get over it. You better ask another question, which is how well do your 25-year-olds do? And that's an interesting question. We have no data on that. But do your child-rearing practices and my child-rearing practices produce young adults that are capable and competent and can face the world? In the USA, the answer is an overwhelming yes. Yang Zhao, a Chinese scholar, has a new book out called Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Dragon? And it's all about his growing up in China and his living in the United States. And he says in that book, he's a wonderful scholar, he says in that book, the Chinese produce the best and the worst systems of education in the world. Best because they can top anybody on scores. And he points out that the Chinese have been taking standardized achievement tests since the year 606. Okay. Standardized achievement tests have been part of the civil service for China. It's very important that you do well on those tests. So that's part of that culture. He also says that the Chinese are the worst system in the world in that they teach conformity to everything, and the students don't question anything, and he'd much rather have a US kid that questions him, that raises a hand, and that has more entrepreneurial activity in mind than the Chinese kids he grew up with. Chinese have something called test hell. It looks a little different than yours and mine, I think. Here are children at recite the Dizi Gui, which translates as standards for being a good student and child. They're in the playground of Jialei Center Primary School in Hainan Province. Well, I've been with a lot of Spanish kids, and I've been with a lot of American kids. We don't raise them this way, okay? And we don't want to raise them this way. So we have a different view of childhood. It will inevitably lead to different scores on a standardized test. The US does reasonably well on things. We just had the World Global Enterprise Entrepreneurship Index, the Getty. So not the PISA, which we don't do well on, but the Getty. No one reported the Getty in the newspapers. They always report the PISA. But in the Getty, 120 countries were assessed, researchers from very good places. The #1 country in the world was, ta-da, the USA in entrepreneurship. So our 25-year-olds, 35-year-olds seem to be doing well, even though our 15-year-olds are not. They also measured for the first time entrepreneurship in women, because so many more women in the Western world are going into leadership roles in industry. The US was #1, and they said that the gap between the United States and other countries is both large and widening, not narrowing. So I think I have nothing to worry about as a United States citizen, but our president is worried, our secretary is worried, our newspapers are worried, all the leaders of government are worried that our kids can't compete. Looks to me like we're competing just fine. So it looks to me that in the United States, and I'm not sure this is true of Spain, but in the United States, we are actually producing more college grads than we can fit into our industrial system. In 1970, 1 in 100 taxi drivers had a college degree. Now, 15 in 100 have college degrees. In 1970, 2 in 100 firefighters had a college degree. Now, 15 in 100 have a college degree. It is now likely that of the baristas in the US, the baristas are the people who serve us Starbucks coffee. Okay, they're not called waiters and waitresses. They are baristas. The baristas, 25% of them have a 2-year or a 4-year college degree. The problem in the US is not a shortage of college-educated talent. It is a shortage of jobs. That's our problem. But the press doesn't understand that. I think the same is true of Spain. I don't think you have a shortage of talent. I think you have a shortage of jobs. My understanding is young people 18 to 25 are having trouble finding work in Spain. Well, that's your problem. It's not the schools. Schools are turning out talented people, but the schools get blamed for it. So we get lots of people worried about the public schools, and they're supporting private schools, charter schools, which we have in the US. These are public monies used to fund schools that people run on their own. And it's a market economy. They're making lots of money with public money. So what did we do about it? We decided to take on the myths of schooling, as I told you. And the first big myth we took on was that the US schools are doing terrible. And we can start that, and I'll go through this very quickly because it's boring, it's lots of graphs, but I'll give you a sense of them. We took on the big myth that the US doesn't do well in international competition. We took that on simply by breaking up the scores in the US by social class. When the reports come out on PISA, the US is 21st in reading, 32nd in mathematics, 23rd in science, and everybody goes crazy. Oh my God, the US can't compete. Oh my God, we're a failing nation, etc. Okay? That's what the newspapers report, because reporters are too stupid to go into the actual report and break it down by social class. Let me do that for you. Here's mathematics, our weakest area. The top bar, when it says less than 10%, that's a school that serves families where less than 10% of the people are in poverty. 10 to 25% of the families are in poverty. And all the way down, you see the OECD average, the US average, and then where we have a lot of poverty, 50% to 75%, 75% or more. You see that the US kids in schools that serve relatively wealthy families, they actually placed 6th in the world, I think it was. 6th in the world, and the next group, where under 25% of the kids are in poverty, placed 17th in the world. So even in our weakest area, 13 million US kids in those two groups did very well. But the newspapers didn't tell you that. They didn't tell you that our problem is with poor children who are not doing well. If we go to science, it's exactly the same pattern. The US kids in science, kids who go to school where under 10% of their classmates are in poverty were beaten by only one other country in the world, and that was Shanghai, which our newspapers forgot to mention is not a country. It's really a province or a city-state. And it's the city-state province with the highest percentage of college graduates of any place in China. It's also a place where PISA purposely, systematically, left out a couple of 100,000 kids from their sample. That's not discussed. But to get to Shanghai, to get to, Shanghai, to get to Shanghai internally, you have to have papers from the Chinese government. So they have internal migrants. And China tries to keep them out of Shanghai in the rural parts of the world. But they come in illegally. The public schools in Shanghai, which most people have to pay for because the schools are really not free, they will not take these children. So there's something like 200,000 kids that don't go to school. And they were not in the PISA sample, and PISA let them get away with it. They wouldn't let Spain get away with that. Okay? They wouldn't let the US get away with that. But they let China get away with it. So the kids do very, very well. In reading, we're one of the highest scoring nations in the world if you're in schools that are not with poverty. In fact, if we take the first three groups, which has poverty rates under 50% for the schools, it turns out that our children compete, I forget what we are, something like 25 million kids average about 5th or 6th in the world. We're doing fine. It's our average score when all the kids are included that shows what the United States problem is. Its problem is poverty and the schools that poor kids go to. It's not bad teachers. It's not bad curriculum. It's not unions, as we hear the reformers complain about teacher unions. It's none of those things. Poor kids do not do well in the US schools. Partly it's neighborhood, partly it's family, partly it's the curriculum, and the teachers are not the best in the poorest schools, but it's certainly not the failing of teachers in general, who are often the same teachers now teaching in schools that serve upper income kids. Here's what really happens on these tests. This is not known, but standardized achievement tests, not the teachers' tests, but standardized achievement tests, when you break up the variation, you take a test like PISA. You have scores for 3,000 kids. And you say, what percentage of that variation in all those scores for those kids can be explained by teachers schools, and outside of school factors, neighborhood, family, income, that sort of thing. The answer for every standardized test we know is that 60% of that variation comes from outside the school. Okay? Neighborhoods matter. Family incomes matter. Who your neighbors are matters. Who the cohort you go to school with matters. Teachers only have weak effects on that. They have strong effects on individual kids. They change the lives of human beings. They don't change test scores very much. So the data from the United States is quite clear. 60% of the variation is coming from outside of school factors. If you have a lot of poor kids in a neighborhood, you can almost predict those schools are not going to do well, no matter how hard the teachers try. Occasionally, they overcome it, but not often. What are the outside of school factors? The percentage of low birth weight children in a neighborhood, inadequate medical, dental, and vision care, food insecurity, environmental pollutants, family relations and stress, the percent of mothers at the site that are single or are teen parents, percent of mothers that do not possess a high school degree, on and on and on and on. This is what counts on a standardized test. So our children who are in schools that serve the poor are not doing well, and it has nothing to do with our teachers, despite the fact that the newspapers will blame our teachers. I'll skip that. Here's a way to look at this that's quite interesting, I think. You don't get a sample big enough in Spain to do what I'm going to do now. This is a sample from Australia. They sampled their PISA scores in such a way that I'm going to make some interesting statements for you. Down the rows are 5 levels of family income for a kid. Level 1, do we have a pointer on here? Probably. Yeah. These are the 20% of kids with the lowest family income. The next group, next group, next group. These are the 20% of the kids with the highest family incomes. So the rows are showing family income. Okay? The columns are the kinds of families the school serves. So this is a school that serves very poor kids, families. Next, next, next. This is a school that primarily serves very wealthy kids. You can often think of this as the poor neighborhood school, the neighborhood school that serves the wealthy. Okay? So now we have a table in which we have right here poor kids in a school that serves the poor, and over here we have rich kids in a school that serves the rich. Now filling this in is a lesson in PISA and a lesson for everybody who's an educator. If we just surround the center score, this is 512. The PISA average is 500. These are kids, middle-class kids, in middle-class schools, and guess what they score? Right around the middle. Okay? But the minute you go to a poorer kid, they don't score as well. Oops, I pressed something wrong. The minute you go to a poorer school, they don't score as well, but you go to a richer school, they score better. If you go to a school that serves, these are poorer kids, these are wealthier kids. These are schools that serve poorer kids, these are schools that serve wealthy kids. You immediately see a pattern on what the scores are. Let's fill that out a little. It looks like as schools serve better, more financially able, schools serve families that have more income, the kids' scores go up. If schools serve families that have more income, the scores go up. Now here's the most important finding from the Australian data that I will bet would replicate in Spain if we had the sample for it. These children are scoring way off the average of PISA. These students are scoring way above the average of PISA. These children will never meet in life. They are Australian kids that will never meet in life. That's the prediction. These are 15-year-olds whose futures are sealed. These kids will go on to the best colleges, to the best industries, work in government. These kids will be working with their hands if they get jobs at all. And it's all about what your family income is and what kinds of schools, what kinds of families you're in. Okay? That's the lesson of this, and it's very disheartening because the United States keeps trying to fix its teachers, keeps trying to fix its curriculum, and it does nothing about inequality. And inequality is the key factor here. Well, what else did we try to demystify? I'm going to try to end in about 6 minutes, 7 minutes. We did lots of stuff on inequality. The TIMSS data shows the same. The PEARLS data shows the same. Lots of data shows that. Turns out that the US, this is the percentage of teachers working in schools where more than 30% of the students are disadvantaged. Okay? Spain is down here somewhere. You're at an under 20% rate. Your poor neighborhoods are distributed better. Your poor kids are distributed better. In the US, 64% of our teachers are in schools where over 30% of the kids are in poverty. We have ghettoized our kids more than you have, and it makes for very hard teaching. Well, what else did we try to demystify? We tried to demystify a policy in the US called move on when reading. If a child's not reading well in the 3rd grade, they leave them back. Do you leave kids back in Spain? No? You don't have a policy of leaving children back. You leave a child back? Repeat a grade? Okay. Okay, well, you have the policy too. In the US, this has become state policy in 16 states, and many others do it. But here's what people don't know. The research is really quite clear. In 1975, 44 studies of retaining children were reviewed. The evidence failed to support it. 10 years later, an additional set of studies reviewed it, didn't support it. 17 years after that, an additional set were done, didn't support it. We have absolute, positive, convincing data that if you leave a child back, they're more likely, 20% more likely to drop out of school before the end of high school. And if they're left back twice, they're 70% more likely to be left back. We get no evidence that leaving a kid back is the right choice for most kids. And the politicians continue to do it. They say they're giving children the gift of time. That's nonsense. Children consider themselves failures. The parents consider them failures. It's not the gift of time. It's a horrible thing. Teachers, I know teachers have a problem with heterogeneity in their classroom, but leaving the kid back is not the solution. In my state, they leave back a lot of kids, meaning they're going to pay for an extra year of schooling if the child stayed, which means the legislature has committed $8,000 extra to this one kid they're going to leave back. So I asked our director of schools, this chief state school officer, why not give $4,000 this year and $4,000 next year to a tutor and keep the kid moving along? It's the same $8,000. They said, we can't do that. I said, why? They said, well, because that would be wrong. There's no explanation for it. They're going to be cruel instead of using the money in a more sensible way. So we tried to point that out. We also got very angry with the people who are against early childhood education. I think you have a better record on that than we do. But here's a quote from the head of the Goldwater Institute, one of the most important think tanks in the US. She says, for nearly 40 years, local, state, and federal governments and diverse private sources have funded early intervention programs for low-income children, and benefits to the children have been few and fleeting. That is a lie. The data from PISA countries, the data from the US, all show that early childhood education pays off. It pays off in reduced special education. It pays off in higher test scores. The person just simply lies. And they're very cavalier about it. They don't want to pay the taxes. So we took them on, wrote a big section on that. One of our Nobel-winning economists, James Heckman, has estimated that early childhood education returns $2 to $9 for every dollar invested. But you have to put it up now, and your return is 30 years later. And we have people who won't play that game. It's really sad. We have lots of private schools in the US, as you do. It's often a tradition. But the tradition in the US is that private schools, or the thinking is that private schools are better than public schools. So we took on that myth. What does that look like? before we adjust test scores on our national tests, we can look at the private schools, we can look at Catholic schools, Lutheran schools, conservative Christian schools, and other private schools that are not religious-based. This is their average score on our standardized tests before we do anything to it. So in every case, the private schools are outperforming a matched public school, okay? So people are right. Private schools are better than public schools. Except the minute you adjust for the social class of who's attending those schools, the public schools do better. It's who you go to school with that determines those scores. It's not better teachers, it's not better curriculum, it's not smaller classes, it's the social class of who you're going to school with. The minute we adjust for social class, bingo, public schools do better. We took on another one. We have charter schools. These are 4 of the best charter schools in the United States, and they're all located in Arizona. They're open to everybody, they say. You go on a waiting list. You can be a member of a charter school. So we looked at it. This is the percentage of students on free and reduced lunch in the state of Arizona. 35% of our kids are poor and get special lunches. Now, in these 4 excelling charter schools, open to anybody, what percentage of their kids are on free and reduced lunch? 0, 0, 0, 0. There isn't a single kid that's poor in any of those schools. But they say they're open to anyone. But they don't take them, so they cancel them out. Percentage of students who are English language learners. We have a large Mexican population, Spanish speakers in Arizona. In the state, we have about 8% of the kids who are in need of language training. What do the charter schools get? 0, 0, 0, 0. It's just outrageous. They do more of that. But here's what else they do. Here's one of those famous charter schools, one of the best in the US. In 5th grade, they had 140-something students. But they graduated in grade 12 at the end of high school, 21. Guess how they get their reputation? They throw out the kids they don't want. We can't do that in the public schools. We don't do that in the public schools. We work with the kids. Some of them we can't stand. Okay? I've been a teacher. I've had students I can't stand. Okay? But we work with them. We do the best we can. These people throw them out, and then they look really good when they say, all of our students go on to college. Well, they just threw out 120 of them. That's easy to say. So we took on myth after myth after myth to try to say, look, folks, the world is not running quite the way you think it is. Do you have anything else here? The charter schools are now the darling of Wall Street. You're invited. Bonds and blackboards. How to invest in charter schools and make a fortune. So we're privatizing our public monies, and we don't take all the kids. We take only those kids that we think we can get a good score from. It's a horrible situation we're going through in the US right now. And I worry about Europe because everything we do in the US drifts over the ocean, and you get it a year or 2 later. And it's sold by people who, like Condoleezza Rice, our former Secretary of Education, she was one of those that argued our schools are failing. Joel Klein, the former Chancellor of New York, the Pearson Corporation. They're all out to make money. They're not out to help our children or our countries. Okay. So that pretty much ends it. We wrote the book because we're very concerned that we could lose our public education system, which may have been the greatest invention the United States ever had. In the 19th century, we invented the Gatling gun and steam engines, and we perfected the automobile, and we did lots of other things that made the United States a really power to be reckoned with. But in the 1850s or so, we had our best invention, and it was probably the public schools. Open to everyone, free, supported by taxes. That's our gift to the rest of the world, and we're destroying it, okay, under the market economy we all live under. That's why we wrote the book. We think making fun of people, going to public meetings, writing letters to the editor, writing little op-ed pieces, we call them, for the newspapers, And being politically active is the only way to preserve our public education system. And defending a vision of childhood that you have and we have. I'm not ashamed of our childhood. I don't care about the test scores. I care that we raise healthy children, healthy in their sexuality, healthy in their work ethic, healthy in their beliefs about society. That to me means a lot more than a PISA score. So that's why we wrote the book. I'm glad to share it with you, and I hope you take on this job of writing about your own myths and confronting your own politicians. Remember what I said at the beginning. People are entitled to their opinions, but not their facts, okay? So confront people. Thank you for inviting me. I would be delighted to take questions.
He vist que molts models dels que ha explicat de les diferències entre l'alumnat de l'escola pública i l'escola privada s'assemblen molt al que ens passa aquí. Ja no parlo de la resta de l'Estat, que conec menys, però que suposo que és semblant. Parlo de Catalunya perquè conec bastant bé el sistema educatiu que hi ha aquí. Hi ha algunes excepcions i depèn dels barris. Aquí els alumnes assisteixen a les escoles públiques en funció del barri que viuen. I aleshores els barris benestants, de família benestants, les escoles públiques tant de primària com els instituts de secundària tenen un alumnat fills de professionals i els hi permet, diguéssim, tenir uns nivells d'escolarització millors que els alumnes que pertanyen a barris més, diríem, en famílies que no són benestants. Aquí hi ha una tradició a Catalunya de que a l'escola pública és bo que els alumnes coneguin la diversitat tant de classes socials com de cultures. I això ens ha funcionat, diríem, fins que la migració de països, de cultures molt diferents, doncs està aquí. Aleshores, això ha distorsionat una mica l'equilibri d'aquestes escoles públiques. Hi ha excepcions, hi ha centres de secundària amb molt bons resultats, perquè també es passen les proves PISA, hi ha escoles de primària amb molt bons resultats, el que sí que coincideixo amb la seva exposició és que els resultats estan en funció no del professorat, sinó de la configuració de l'escola en general, del tipus d'alumnat que existeix en aquesta escola. Una altra cosa volia dir que no acabo d'estar d'acord amb el que vostè ha opinat, que suposo que el treball d'investigació que s'ha fet sobre els alumnes repetidors és interessant. Aquí, en principi, no es deixava repetir els alumnes, era com una cosa, era tabú. I jo penso que s'ha d'individualitzar, perquè quan un alumne no repeteix i no adquireix els coneixements, parlo de llegir, escriure i els coneixements bàsics, i va passant de curs en curs, no se li fa una atenció diferent i pot arribar a acabar un ensenyament primari analfabet. Aleshores, jo penso que hi ha molts sistemes, no tindria per què repetir, potser si l'atenció fos l'adequada i passés de curs, això no passaria. Però, a vegades, en moments puntuals i segons l'alumne, és com un regal, com ha dit vostè, que el centre el deixi repetir, perquè el centre no vol que repeteixi, i més si és conflictiu, que passi i marxi. Però surt amb un nivell que no és ni el primari. I això tant passa a l'ensenyament primari com al secundari. Aleshores, jo no crec que s'hagi de repetir per norma, però jo poso un interrogant sobre l'estar totalment en contra de la repetició. Si hi hagués un altre sistema, potser sí, però aquí no existeix l'altre sistema. Quan un alumne passa de curs, passa amb els alumnes que van seguint, i si ell no segueix, puntó. Gràcies.
First, you make the same point that you have some excellent public schools. But you also point out that your excellent public schools are often in neighborhoods that have very middle-class people, upwardly mobile people, wealthy people. Well, that's exactly what the situation is. You can affect your test scores more by housing policy than you can by better teachers. Okay? That's the lesson we're learning in the US. Who you go to school with matters a lot. If your cohort is going to go to college, you go to college. If your cohort is going to be a welder, you become a welder. Nothing wrong with being a welder, but it's the cohort determines your aspirations. And so you have the same situation here determined by housing policy. It's exactly the same as ours. I want to argue with you, though, when you say you think leaving a child back sometimes is a good thing. My argument is this: sometimes it's a good thing. You don't know in advance for which kid it will work. And if you want to play the odds, for 9 out of 10 children, it's the wrong choice. And you and I and every teacher I've met is not smart enough to know in advance who should be left back. The data are absolutely clear. You have twins, you put one ahead, leave one back. The twin that was put ahead will be happier with school and ultimately do better. That's what the data says. So you can have your beliefs, but the research says you're wrong. Okay.
Gràcies per donar-nos llum a aquesta xarra que comparteixo moltíssim. Jo penso que la vostra recerca i la d'aquí té molts punts en comú. I diria una cosa amb la companya que ha parlat. M'agradaria poder debatre, i per això és important els enfrontaments, els col·loquis, perquè jo diria que en primer lloc jo crec que la realitat de Catalunya és una realitat de molta gent i és veritat que la transformació social s'està fent dia a dia i per tant hem de comptar amb el que hi ha. Quan ella diu que la diversitat de barris ha vingut donada per la forta immigració, sí, aquesta diversitat ha augmentat, potser ha dit, en la forta immigració, sí, ha forta immigració, però jo diria que és a partir d'aquest repte que tenim nosaltres, és com atendre, com poder donar resposta a tota la població infantil, sigui on sigui, el lloc on ha nascut i el lloc on viu. I si viu aquí, viu aquí. I si ha nascut al Perú, ha nascut al Perú. I si ha nascut al Marroc, ha nascut al Marroc. Viu aquí, treballen aquí els seus pares el que poden i evidentment nosaltres hem de donar una escola de qualitat, sigui on sigui i amb els professors millors preparats, que això ja no depèn només de nosaltres. Parlo des de ser jo professora de secundària. Després també voldria discrepar amb el tema de la repetició. Per mi és una lacra, perquè jo a la meva pràctica com a professora en les escoles de secundària i com a psicopedagoga puc dir a la meva pràctica que el 1% d'alumnes que repeteixen tenen èxit en la seva progressió escolar. Quan jo dic un 1% vull dir que hi ha algú que li va bé, però aquest algú, com ha dit molt bé vostè, te la jugues a l'atzar, és a dir, no saps si tindrà èxit, només ho saps quan ha reeixit aquell curs, el qual el risc és molt alt. Però així i tot, amb aquest risc, hi ha algú que se'n surt bé, l'1% en el centre on soc jo. Per tant, si això ho estandarditzem a altres escoles de secundària, parlo de secundària però segurament a primària, per mi és una lacra. Perquè si el sistema educatiu a Catalunya permet una avaluació continuada, i així ho diem al llarg del nostre sistema educatiu des de la reforma educativa del César Coll, ara no me'n recordo la LOCSE, si realment ens creiem en l'avaluació continuada, el repte nostre és que durant aquest any educatiu, durant aquest any escolar, l'alumne ha de tenir tantes oportunitats com calgui per reeixir-se el curs. Hem de fer el que sigui necessari. Per tant, la repetició per mi és un fracàs i, per tant, una conseqüència del propi alumne que perd els seus referents dels grups, dels seus amics, dels seus companys, etc etc. I ja està. Moltes gràcies.
Having an immigrant population and doing your best to both socialize them to Catalonia, to Spain, to Europe if they're non-European, is exactly what we all need to do. We have an immigrant situation too. This is our obligation. That doesn't change the fact that it's very hard. Okay? And most immigrants, well, we have highly educated immigrants in the United States coming in from China, coming in from Korea, coming in from India. But we also have Nigerians and others coming in, and they don't have the educational background, and it's very hard to provide it. They often live with other people in their culture. That's a natural, and it becomes very difficult. What I would recommend is that we put extra money in those programs and to try to socialize kids to my country, your country, preschools. England does a very good job of this. Ursula and I have visited some schools in England that purposely are designated immigrant schools and try their best to do things. So I think the investment is a wise one. I mean, these are the future Spanish or American citizens, and we have to do our best. It's hard, okay? It's very hard. The neighborhoods they're in often have gangs. The neighborhoods they're in often have drugs. People make money on the side because they're not making it in the regular economy. It becomes very difficult. But not to do it, not to work hard at that is a mistake. Okay, and that's the problem. On leaving a kid back, again, I'm going to argue with both of you again. You don't have the data on what would happen if you had this child and that child had an identical twin. And you leave one back and you let the other go. You don't have that data. So you don't know what would happen. Everything we do know says that the twin who was moved ahead would do better. You can make the case that, a very good case, that leaving a child back gets them the extra time they need to learn the things. My argument would be leaving back in the United States is almost always discriminatory. It is males, Hispanic, black, poor. That's who gets left back in the US. It is never a white middle-class girl. Okay, that just doesn't happen. Everybody's afraid of the sexuality issues for boys and girls, but black, poor, Hispanic, male, that gets left back. So it's a discriminatory policy. Secondly, if the district you're in, the school funding agency, is willing to pay an extra year's money for a child, then use the money for tutors. The single most powerful education intervention we have in the world is one-to-one, a knowledgeable person helping another person. That's the powerful intervention. You've got the money. Your authority committed, what, $7,000, $8,000, $10,000, whatever it costs for a year. Don't spend it that way. Spend it on tutors. Ursula and I have a grandchild, William, third grade, middle of third grade. His teacher told our son and daughter-in-law, William is probably going to be left back. He's not reading. So we mobilized. They got him a tutor. At the end of the third grade, William was reading on grade level. Middle-class white kids don't get left back. Okay? The resources are brought to bear. We should bring those resources to bear for every child. That's how I'd argue it, because the data is overwhelmingly clear to me. In fact, I didn't read something to you. Since this came up twice, I want to read something if I can. When a group of kids who were left back in the United States were given a list of things to describe their feelings. These were, I think, third graders or second graders. Describe their feelings. Which of these things on the list was like your feeling? Let me read to you. When they were interviewed, they said that being left back was the emotional equivalent of wetting their pants in school or being caught stealing. That's the emotions. And only 2 events on the list were more distressing to the children: the death of a parent or going blind. This is very, very hard on children. I think it's cruel when we should spend the money. I don't doubt that either of you are right, This child needs help. That's the key. But how we choose to spend our resources, I would never do it by leaving a child back. Thank you.
Primero de todo, gracias por pasar una tarde con nosotros. Nos ha gustado mucho conocerle. Y luego tenía una duda, cuando has dicho que se demandan muchos profesores de STEAM y luego realmente no se necesitan, quería saber si hay algún motivo ideológico o algún motivo detrás que hagan surgir esta demanda.
Okay, first of all, the list I tried to show you was that everybody's been demanding STEM workers forever, okay? So we don't have huge numbers of students committing to STEM as opposed to English literature majors. We have a surplus of literature majors and a smaller number of scientists, mathematicians, engineers. So they're always worried about running out. And it turns out that in the US now we do have what we call spot shortages, a shortage here, a shortage here, a shortage here, a shortage here, which makes people think there's an overall shortage. The problem is that we're hiring STEM people for projects. So when the project is over, those people in, let's say, Seattle are out of work. But their new project starts in Atlanta, Georgia, and they don't have enough workers. Okay? So we have enough workers in the country, we don't always have them in the right place. So there's an illusion of a shortage because we're a huge country and people don't know what's available other places. Why they keep asking for more STEM workers is partly, I think it's related to a superstition. The superstition is that mathematicians and scientists are great intellects. Prestige of the mathematician and the scientist. They don't give credit to the playwright, the person who choreographs a ballet. Those are not great thinkers in the public's mind. So a scientist is a great thinker. I had this fight with a mathematician. So we need math people so people can think straight. Well, John Dewey's a good philosopher. I don't think he did any math. There are a whole bunch of really good thinkers who are not mathematicians. Now, it turns out there are a whole bunch of really good thinkers who were mathematicians. But you can't prove the argument that way, okay? So I think it's a prestige issue. Scientists and mathematicians are, they win Nobel Prizes. People who take a business degree don't. They get rich, but they don't win prizes. So it's a prestige thing. I don't think learning math makes you a better thinker. I think thinking deeply about anything makes you a better thinker.
La pregunta és si hi ha alguna diferència o no, si es veu diferència o no en els resultats, encara que siguin quantitatius, però també qualitatius, amb les persones que han pogut, o amb els alumnes que han pogut anar a preescolar, que per tant han hagut de ser pagades pròpiament. Per tant són escoles privades. No?
I skipped over some things, but the PISA people say the following. That should be $100. For every $100 you pay for pre-primary education, you get one more point on a PISA test. For reducing the pupil-teacher ratio by one student in preschool, you get a point. Increase the duration by 1 year of preschool, you get about 10 points. Increase 1% the proportion of students who attend pre-primary education, you get 5 points. That is, you take all of the OECD nations and you say, preschool, no preschool, what do you get? The answer is overwhelmingly good things, okay? The analysis of Sweden and Great Britain was among the best I've ever seen, because about 10, 12 years ago, they didn't universalize preschool. So they could run a little study. Kids who went and didn't go to preschool, now 15 years of age, in Sweden and Great Britain, and statistically controlled for social class, and they get like 12, 15, 18 points more on a PISA test if you've gone to preschool. Okay, so the answer is it really pays off. In the US, we only have a small percentage of kids going to preschools that are government funded. And a large percentage of the kids who go to preschool, parents are paying for. But still, only about 50% of our kids go to preschool, and then often for just 1 year, the year before kindergarten. So we have a long way to go. President Obama has asked Congress, a Congress that's the cheapest we've ever had, he's asked Congress for money for universal preschool, starting at age 2 or something. And Finland does it very, very well. And the Finnish kids score very, very well because they're socialized to school. They like school. School is a place they want to be. And I think we could do that, but we don't have the willpower.
Jo li voldria donar les gràcies a David perquè realment generosament ha ocupat el seu temps i els seus esforços per estar aquí amb nosaltres. I jo m'emporto una cosa que ja fa temps que la tinc, però cada vegada me l'emporto més. Ens hem de deixar de queixar-nos i criticar i hem de passar a l'acció. I hem de passar a l'acció amb dades, amb evidències, no jo creo y a mí me parece, sinó vinga aquí i machacar, i machacar, i machacar. Si realment creiem en que l'educació pública universal, que està orientada no a competir, sinó a que les persones desenvolupen la seva capacitat de ser, hem de fer això, no només queixar-nos i criticar, sinó posar-nos a fer recerca, posar-nos a presentar dades, a presentar-les, a discutir-les, etcètera, etcètera. Jo de veritat que li agraeixo molt a David i a Úrsula que estiguin aquí avui i a tots vosaltres, perquè sense vosaltres tampoc hagués estat possible això. Així és que ànimo, que no nos vencerán.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.